Daniel Williams was the epitome of success, an ambitious, self-made millionaire with a reputation for precision and perfection. His business empire spanned across industries, and he had everything anyone could dream of. His beautiful wife, Olivia, and their young son, Ethan, completed the picture of his ideal life. But behind the polished exterior of wealth and success, a deeper struggle lurked, one that had been silently growing for the past year. Ethan, their 7-year-old son, had been suffering from an undiagnosed illness, one that left the doctors scratching their heads and his parents grasping at straws. His energy levels were low, he had constant fevers, and his once joyful nature seemed to dim with each passing day. Daniel had always been a man who believed in control, in doing whatever it took to overcome obstacles. Yet as days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, nothing seemed to make Ethan better. The doctors could only offer vague explanations and ineffective treatments, and no matter how many specialists they consulted, no one had an answer. As the pressure mounted, Daniel's frustration grew. He had built his entire life around the concept of success, yet his own son was suffering, and there was nothing he could do. Olivia, too, was distraught, but her strength was starting to fray. In their wealthy world, there were many luxuries, but none that could heal their son. Finally, in a desperate attempt to give Olivia some relief and to ensure Ethan had the care he desperately needed, Daniel made a decision that would alter their lives forever. He hired a nanny. Lisa Simmons came highly recommended, with glowing references from her previous employers and an aura of calm professionalism that Daniel found reassuring. She was in her early 30s, had a degree in childhood education, and had worked with children facing health challenges before. When she arrived at their upscale home in the city, Daniel felt a wave of relief wash over him. Ethan seemed to warm to her quickly, and for the first time in months, Daniel thought things might start to feel normal again. Lisa had a soft, nurturing approach that seemed to put Ethan at ease, and she was always patient, attentive, and gentle in her care. Daniel found himself feeling grateful, knowing that he could finally focus on work without worrying about his son's well-being. As weeks passed, though, something began to shift in the air. It was subtle at first, just little things Daniel noticed when he was around. A slight hesitation in Lisa's voice when she interacted with Ethan, an occasional shortness in her tone. He dismissed it at first, telling himself he was simply stressed from the mounting pressures of running a business and keeping up appearances. But one evening, as Daniel came home early from a meeting, he overheard a conversation between Olivia and Lisa. He stood quietly by the door, listening as Lisa spoke a little too sharply to Ethan, telling him that he needed to stop being difficult and spoiled. The words were harsh and uncharacteristic of the kind, patient woman Daniel had come to trust. It startled him, but he shrugged it off. Perhaps Lisa had had a rough day. But as time went on, the unsettling feeling wouldn't go away. Daniel couldn't shake the sense that something wasn't right. Ethan seemed more withdrawn, and there were moments when he'd complain of strange aches or would suddenly get upset for no apparent reason. He began to lose weight, and Daniel noticed he was more lethargic after Lisa had spent the day with him. The change in Ethan was subtle but undeniable. It was as if the joy he once had in his eyes was fading, like a candle flickering out in the dark. Daniel began to wonder if perhaps he had made a mistake in hiring Lisa. He questioned whether she was truly the right fit, whether her approach was having an effect on Ethan's health. But every time he raised the issue with Olivia, she assured him that it was nothing. She reminded him that Ethan's illness was always unpredictable and that Lisa was doing her best. Still, something gnawed at Daniel. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that his gut was telling him something wasn't right, and he couldn't ignore it. In his world, instincts had always served him well, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something. He had built his empire on making tough decisions, facing down risks, and never leaving anything to chance, and so he made a decision that would change everything. He would install cameras. At first, the idea felt like a betrayal. Lisa had been kind to his family, and he didn't want to violate that trust. But he had to know the truth. For his son's sake, for the sake of their family's peace of mind, he needed to be sure that Lisa was genuinely caring for Ethan as she claimed. Daniel set up hidden cameras around the house, focusing on Ethan's room and the areas where Lisa would spend most of her time with him. He justified it to himself by telling himself it was just a precaution. He told himself he wasn't spying on Lisa for the wrong reasons. He just wanted to make sure Ethan was safe. But deep down, Daniel knew the decision was a dangerous one. It was a breach of trust, and he would have to face the consequences if he discovered something that would shatter the image of the woman who had seemed so perfect. Little did he know, the footage he was about to uncover would change everything. Not just for him, but for his entire family. Daniel spent several restless nights tossing and turning, the weight of his decision pressing down on him. He knew he couldn't ignore his instincts, but he also understood the consequences that could come with it. He tried to justify it, telling himself that he wasn't doing this because he didn't trust Lisa as a person, but because his primary concern had to be Ethan's well-being. As a father, it was his responsibility to protect his son, no matter the cost. He couldn't allow himself to remain in the dark. The next morning, after the final camera had been carefully installed in Ethan's room, Daniel made sure to leave the house for a business trip, giving Lisa the space she needed to go about her day with Ethan, unaware that she was being watched. He told Olivia about the cameras, but they had both agreed that it would be best to wait until they had concrete evidence before confronting Lisa. Daniel spent the next few days in a haze of anticipation and guilt, constantly checking the footage during every free moment. At first, the footage showed nothing out of the ordinary. Lisa was as professional and kind as Daniel had seen her before, interacting patiently with Ethan, offering him meals, playing with him, and helping him with his daily routines. It seemed like the reassurance Daniel had hoped for. But as he watched more, subtle things began to stand out. Lisa's interactions with Ethan began to feel colder, more distant. There were moments when she would raise her voice slightly, telling Ethan to stop whining when he asked for something as simple as a drink of water. Daniel couldn't believe it. These were the same behaviors he'd overheard once, but had dismissed as nothing more than his imagination running wild. But here, on the footage, they were happening over and over again. It wasn't just the sharpness in her voice that disturbed him. It was the way she seemed to look at Ethan sometimes, with a brief but unsettling expression of impatience, almost as though she resented him for being ill. It made Daniel's stomach turn. Ethan, for his part, seemed to withdraw into himself more and more with each passing day. Where once he was energetic and bright, he now appeared sluggish and quiet, barely responding to Lisa's attempts to engage him in games or conversations. At one point, Daniel watched as Lisa moved Ethan from one room to another. She was guiding him by the arm, but there was something in the way she held him, just a little too firmly, as if trying to control him. Ethan didn't seem to protest, but Daniel could see the discomfort on his face. The footage continued to pile up, and it was becoming increasingly clear that something was wrong. But it wasn't until a few days later, when Daniel returned home early, that he would witness the moment that confirmed his worst fears. He had arrived quietly, not wanting to alert anyone to his presence, and stood outside the living room for a moment to hear the familiar sound of laughter between Lisa and Ethan. But what he heard instead was an unsettling silence, broken by Lisa's voice, sharper than he had ever heard it before. "Stop acting like a baby," Lisa snapped. Ethan, who had been sitting on the floor with a book, flinched, his body shrinking into itself. "I told you, if you don't stop being difficult, I won't help you." The words hit Daniel like a punch to the gut. His heart raced, and his breath caught in his throat. He had heard enough. He couldn't believe it. He stepped into the room, and as soon as Lisa saw him, her face froze, her smile faltering. Ethan looked up at his father, his face pale and his eyes wide. "Dad, I didn't want to be difficult," he muttered, his voice barely a whisper. The guilt in Ethan's voice made Daniel's heart break. He looked from Ethan to Lisa, his eyes narrowing in disbelief. "What's going on here?" Daniel asked, his voice sharp with a mixture of confusion and anger. Lisa quickly regained her composure, her calm demeanor returning. "It's nothing," she said with a forced smile. "Ethan was just upset. He's been a little extra sensitive lately, with his health and all. I'm sorry if I came across as harsh." But Daniel wasn't convinced. The coldness in her tone, the sharpness of her words, it all didn't add up. And it wasn't just one instance. He had now seen enough. His gut had been right all along. Something was wrong. Something deeper than simple frustration. He excused himself for a moment, his mind racing. After a few moments of silence, he returned to the footage he had recorded. There, in the quiet glow of his office, Daniel sat and watched the moments he had feared. The subtle manipulation, the harsh words, and worst of all, the coldness that seemed to grow with every passing day. It was clear to him now. Ethan wasn't just ill. He was being mistreated. The decision Daniel had avoided for so long now loomed over him. He could no longer look the other way. He had to confront Lisa, and he had to do it now. But what would that mean for the future of his family? Would this revelation tear apart the trust that had once held them all together? And what about Ethan, who was already suffering so much from his illness? How would he react to his father confronting the woman who had been caring for him? The choices ahead were overwhelming, but Daniel knew one thing for certain. He had to act. No more hesitations, no more waiting for something to change on its own. He had seen the truth, and it was impossible to ignore. The next few days were the most difficult of Daniel's life. He couldn't shake the image of his son's pale face, the way he had flinched when Lisa had snapped at him. That moment haunted him, gnawing at his thoughts every waking hour. He had always trusted his instincts, but never had they felt so urgent, so overwhelming. Daniel knew he had to confront Lisa. He could no longer let his doubts fester in silence. The decision felt heavy, knowing that any confrontation could shatter the trust he had built with Lisa, the woman who had been so kind and professional in the beginning. But his son's well-being had to come first. On a quiet afternoon, when the house seemed unusually still, Daniel found the courage to act. He had to face the woman who had been entrusted with his son's care, and he had to do it without any more excuses. He walked into the living room, where Lisa was sitting with Ethan, watching cartoons. It was a peaceful scene, one that would have seemed normal to anyone walking in. But to Daniel, it felt like the calm before the storm. He cleared his throat to announce his presence, and Lisa turned, her face lighting up in the way it always did when she saw him. But Daniel could see the slight tension in her posture, the way her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "Lisa, can we talk for a moment?" Daniel's voice was calm but firm. There was no point in avoiding the conversation any longer. Lisa gave a polite nod, her expression turning to one of concern. "Of course, Mr. Williams. Is everything okay with Ethan?" The question felt like a hollow courtesy, given the gravity of what Daniel was about to say. "I need to know what's going on," Daniel replied, his voice steady but tinged with a quiet intensity. "What's really happening here with Ethan?" The room went silent. Ethan, who had been playing quietly with his toy truck, looked up at his father, his face shadowed with confusion. Lisa's eyes flickered between Daniel and Ethan. And for a moment, Daniel thought she might try to deny everything. But there was a shift in her expression, just enough for Daniel to see that her calm demeanor was cracking. "I don't know what you mean," Lisa said, her voice unnervingly calm. "I've been doing everything I can for Ethan. I've been patient with him, just as you asked." The words hung in the air, and Daniel felt his anger rise. "It's not just about patience, Lisa. It's about respect, kindness, and understanding. Ethan isn't just a job for you. He's my son." There was a pause. Daniel could see her face falter, the veneer of composure slipping. She started, but Daniel interrupted her. "I saw the footage, Lisa. I saw the way you spoke to him, the way you treated him. You've been harsh, you've been cold, and I can't ignore it any longer. The confession, though expected, still seemed to land with a force that rattled both of them. Lisa's face paled as if Daniel had slapped her. I didn't mean to." Her voice cracked, and for the first time, Daniel saw a hint of something vulnerable in her eyes. Was it guilt? Was it shame? Or was it fear? "You don't understand," she said, her voice trembling now. "I never wanted to hurt him. I swear, I didn't want this to happen. I just didn't know what else to do." Daniel's heart pounded as he stood there, trying to piece together what she was saying. He had thought he understood the situation, but now, seeing her crumble in front of him, he realized that there was more to this than he had anticipated. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, his voice rough with frustration. Lisa took a shaky breath, her eyes darting to the floor as if searching for the right words. "I was just trying to keep everything together," she said, barely above a whisper. "I was under pressure, and I didn't know how to handle it." There was a long pause before she finally looked up at him, her eyes brimming with tears. "I'm in debt, Mr. Williams. A lot of debt. And people. They came after me. They said I had to do certain things, or they would hurt my family. I thought I could control it, but everything spiraled out of my hands. Ethan's health, it was all so much, and I couldn't take it anymore." Daniel stood in stunned silence, trying to process what Lisa was saying. The layers of complexity, the desperation in her voice, were things he never could have imagined. Here was a woman who had started as a professional, who had seemed so dedicated and trustworthy, now admitting to something far darker than he had ever anticipated. "You were threatened?" Daniel asked, his voice low. Lisa nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I had no choice. They said they'd hurt my parents if I didn't do what they wanted. I thought I could handle it, but I couldn't. I didn't know how to make it stop." The confession shook Daniel to his core. Lisa's coldness toward Ethan had come from fear, not malice. She had been under a kind of pressure that few could even begin to understand. But that didn't change what had happened. Ethan had been caught in the crossfire, and that was something Daniel could never overlook. As the realization settled over him, a strange mix of sympathy and anger bubbled up. Daniel wanted to help, to find a way to fix this, but at the same time, he couldn't ignore what had already occurred. The trust had been broken. Ethan had been hurt, both physically and emotionally, and no explanation could undo that. "I never meant for it to go this far," Lisa whispered. "I thought I could keep it hidden. I thought it would all work out. But now I've ruined everything." Daniel took a step back, his mind racing. There were so many decisions to be made, so many ways this could play out. He knew he had to make the right choice, not just for Ethan, but for the future of his family. But as he looked at Lisa, broken and vulnerable in front of him, he couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation settle over him. It was no longer just about the betrayal. It was about understanding the true nature of the circumstances and making a choice that balanced justice and compassion. But first, there were questions that needed answers, and no matter how painful they were, Daniel had to know the full truth before he could make the next move. The days following Daniel's confrontation with Lisa were a blur of emotions, decisions, and sleepless nights. The weight of what he had learned, Lisa's desperation, the threats that had haunted her, and the deep psychological toll it had taken on her, left him reeling. But no matter how much empathy he felt for her, the reality was that Ethan had been caught in the crossfire, and that was a wound that couldn't be ignored. Daniel couldn't simply look the other way, no matter how hard the decision to confront Lisa had been. That same evening, as he sat in his study, staring blankly at the wall, the sound of Ethan's soft footsteps broke his reverie. Ethan had been unusually quiet that day, lost in his own thoughts, which was unlike him. The boy entered the room cautiously, his eyes casting downward, unable to meet his father's gaze. Daniel's heart softened at the sight. Ethan had always been his little fighter, but now, seeing him so withdrawn, Daniel could feel the weight of what had happened to him. "Hey, buddy," Daniel said, his voice gentle. "Come here." Ethan hesitated for a moment, then slowly walked over and climbed into his father's lap. The boy was still small enough that he fit comfortably in Daniel's arms, and for a fleeting moment, Daniel felt that everything might be okay, that this would be just another bad chapter they could leave behind. But the truth of the matter was, they were living through a story that could never be rewritten, not without its scars. "I'm sorry, Dad," Ethan whispered, his voice cracking as he buried his face in Daniel's chest. "I didn't mean to be bad." Daniel's heart clenched. He could barely hold back the tears, fighting the overwhelming urge to tell Ethan that none of this was his fault. "You're not bad, son," Daniel said, his voice tight with emotion. "You're not bad at all." He kissed the top of Ethan's head, feeling the weight of what had happened in those moments when Ethan had been vulnerable to someone he had trusted completely. There was a sense of helplessness, a bitter realization that nothing could change the past. As they sat there together, Daniel's thoughts turned back to Lisa. He had to make a choice, and he knew the longer he delayed, the more difficult it would be. Lisa had broken the trust between them. But the truth of her situation, her debt, her family's safety, was not something that could be easily dismissed. She hadn't acted out of malice, but out of fear and desperation. Yet, that didn't change what she had done. Ethan needed to be safe. His family needed to be protected. But Daniel also realized something else. This wasn't just about justice. It was about how to navigate the mess of human complexity. His heart ached with the knowledge that Lisa, despite her mistakes, had been forced into a corner she hadn't known how to escape. And as much as he wanted to protect his son, he also understood that the only way to move forward was through the truth, and not by letting guilt or fear drive his decisions. The next day, Daniel met with Olivia. They had barely spoken since the confrontation with Lisa, both of them caught in the turmoil of the aftermath. Olivia had been shocked by the revelations, her eyes wide with disbelief as Daniel had explained what had happened. She hadn't known about Lisa's personal struggles, and like Daniel, had trusted her implicitly. The weight of the situation was felt deeply in the silence that had settled between them. Olivia, who had always been strong and protective of their family, now seemed lost, as though the trust she'd built with Lisa had been shattered beyond repair. When Daniel shared with her the details of his conversation with Lisa, Olivia listened quietly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "So, what now?" she finally asked, her voice quiet but heavy. "What do we do, Daniel?" Daniel looked at his wife, his heart aching for the uncertainty in her eyes. This wasn't just a betrayal by someone they'd hired. It was a betrayal by someone who had come into their home, someone they had trusted, and someone who had gotten close to their son. "I don't know," Daniel admitted, his voice thick with the weight of the decision. "I want to help her. I do. But what if Ethan is hurt, emotionally or worse? What if she doesn't even realize the damage she's done? I can't let this slide, Olivia. I can't risk Ethan's safety. But I don't want to ruin her life, either. I know how hard she's been struggling." Olivia nodded slowly, her gaze falling to the floor. "It's not just about us, though," she said. "We have to think about Ethan, too. He's been through so much already. I don't want to expose him to any more turmoil." Daniel ran a hand through his hair, frustration bubbling inside him. "I know. But if I let her stay, what kind of example does that set? I can't put him at risk again." After a long pause, Olivia looked up at Daniel. "So, what are you going to do?" The question hung in the air, and Daniel knew that whatever he decided would shape not only their family's future, but also the path Lisa would take from here on out. He couldn't ignore what had happened, but he also couldn't bear the thought of destroying Lisa's life completely. She had made a mistake, a grave one, but it had come from a place of fear and desperation, and that, in some ways, changed everything. The next few hours were a blur of phone calls and meetings with lawyers. Daniel had to make sure that Ethan was safe and that there would be no more danger from Lisa. But he also realized that helping Lisa wasn't as simple as providing her with financial support. The authorities would need to be involved. Daniel didn't want to send her to jail, but he also couldn't allow the situation to continue as it was. He needed to ensure that Lisa had the proper help she needed, not just for her debt, but for the underlying issues that had driven her to this point. The emotional cost of the entire ordeal weighed heavily on Daniel. His heart had softened toward Lisa, but he couldn't allow that to cloud his judgment. Ethan's future, their family's future, had to come first. As Daniel sat in his office, making the final arrangements, he realized that there was no perfect answer to this situation. No matter what choice he made, it would come with consequences. But he also knew one thing for certain: this decision would be the beginning of a new chapter for their family, and it was up to him to navigate it as best as he could. The days that followed were heavy with uncertainty, as Daniel grappled with the weight of the decision he had to make. The hours seemed to stretch on endlessly as he and Olivia tried to navigate the complex web of emotions, legalities, and consequences. Ethan, ever the sensitive boy, sensed the tension in the air, and although he didn't fully understand what had happened, he could tell something had changed. His usual playful demeanor was replaced by a quiet apprehension, and Daniel knew the impact of this entire situation on his son's mental and emotional state couldn't be ignored. The more Daniel thought about it, the more the lines between right and wrong blurred. The truth was, no matter what he decided, someone would suffer. If he pressed charges against Lisa, it might help protect Ethan from future harm, but it would also destroy Lisa's life. On the other hand, if he forgave Lisa and allowed her to continue working for their family, it could put Ethan at risk again. His moral compass, which had always been clear in his business dealings, now felt unclear. The situation wasn't just black and white. It was a murky gray, filled with nuance and conflicting emotions. His desire for justice and protection for Ethan conflicted with a deep sense of empathy for Lisa's struggles. How could someone like her, someone who had been so professional, so dedicated, have been driven to such extremes? The thought of her debt and the threats hanging over her family tore at his heart. Yet the severity of what had happened couldn't be overlooked. Ethan had suffered, and that was the price of Lisa's desperation. Daniel knew that he could never truly move forward without addressing the situation fully, but what was the right course of action? He called in a lawyer, seeking guidance on how to proceed. As the conversation unfolded, Daniel realized how delicate this matter was. The law would protect Ethan, but it wasn't designed to account for the deeper context of Lisa's actions. The lawyer advised him that pressing charges would be the safest course of action, not just for Ethan, but also for his own peace of mind and protection. But Daniel couldn't help but feel that it wasn't the complete answer. Lisa needed help, not just punishment. But could he really extend that help without jeopardizing everything he'd worked so hard to build for his family? That evening, Daniel sat alone in his office, watching the clock tick by. Olivia had taken Ethan for a walk, giving Daniel the space to think. His mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions, but one thing was becoming clear. If he wanted to maintain his integrity, if he wanted to do what was best for Ethan, he had to act. He couldn't let Lisa's situation cloud his judgment, even if he understood it on a deeply personal level. The next day, Daniel made the decision to confront Lisa once more. This time, there would be no comforting words or emotional explanations. It was time to face the facts and take the next step. When Lisa arrived at the house, her face was pale, her eyes red from lack of sleep. She had been waiting for the inevitable, her termination. But Daniel had something else in mind. He sat her down in the living room, Ethan nowhere to be seen, and faced her with a hard resolve. "I've made my decision," he said, his voice steady, but carrying the weight of a man who knew the impact of his words. Lisa looked at him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, fear and hope mingling in her expression. "I've been advised to involve the authorities, but I'm giving you a choice. I'll arrange for the debt collectors to be dealt with legally, but you need to agree to undergo professional counseling. You'll have to leave our home. but I won't press charges if you take this opportunity to get help. It's the only way I can give Ethan some peace of mind, and it's the only way I can justify not turning your life upside down." For a moment, there was nothing but silence between them. Lisa blinked, her lips trembling as she tried to process what he was offering. "You're not going to press charges," she whispered, disbelief in her voice. Daniel shook his head. "I'm not. But you have to understand, what you did was wrong. You hurt Ethan. He trusted you, and you betrayed that trust. If you're going to be a part of his life moving forward, you'll need to prove that you can be someone he can trust again. That means facing your issues head-on. No more running from them. No more hiding behind excuses." Lisa's eyes filled with tears as she nodded slowly, her face a mixture of relief and shame. "I never wanted to hurt him, Mr. Williams. I didn't. I didn't know what else to do." Daniel didn't speak for a moment, his own emotions stirring. As much as he wanted to offer her a lifeline, he couldn't forget the damage that had been done. "I'm giving you this chance, but you need to understand that this is your only one. If you ever put Ethan in harm's way again, I won't hesitate to protect him. He's my priority." Lisa's breath hitched as she stood up, her voice barely audible. "Thank you. Thank you for this chance. I promise I'll get help. I won't let you down." Daniel watched her leave, his heart heavy with the weight of the decision. The feeling of letting her go, of giving her a chance to redeem herself, sat uneasily with him. But as much as he hated the idea of Lisa being a permanent part of their past, he also couldn't ignore the fact that people made mistakes, and sometimes redemption was possible, even for those who had lost their way. But it was a delicate balance. He would have to keep a watchful eye on things, ensuring that Ethan's safety remained the top priority. As Lisa left, Daniel realized that the consequences of this decision would ripple through his life in ways he hadn't yet imagined. He had chosen the harder path, the one that involved healing and redemption rather than punishment. But now, with Ethan's future hanging in the balance, Daniel couldn't help but wonder if he had made the right call. Would this decision come back to haunt him? Would Lisa follow through on her promise to change? Only time would tell. But in that moment, Daniel could only hope that his choice would ultimately bring peace to his family and allow Ethan the chance to heal from the wounds of the past. Weeks passed, and the decision Daniel had made began to settle into his life, although the ripples it created were far from over. Ethan, though visibly calmer, still carried the weight of the recent events, his once bubbling joy stifled by an unseen burden. Daniel noticed the subtle shifts. Ethan no longer eagerly ran into his arms when he came home. Instead, the boy seemed to seek comfort in the quiet corners of the house, lost in thoughts too mature for his age. Daniel tried everything to reassure him, spending more time with him, attempting to rebuild the trust and the innocence that had been broken. Yet, no matter how much effort he put in, there was no erasing the shadow of the past. Olivia, too, carried her own version of the story. She had always been protective of their family, and the shock of discovering that their trusted nanny had been mistreating Ethan had shaken her to her core. She was less trusting now, always on alert, scrutinizing every interaction between Ethan and the people around him. She had begun counseling to help her process the emotional toll of the betrayal, but there were days when the unease in her eyes revealed how much the incident had changed her, how much it had changed them all. As for Lisa, Daniel had kept his promise. He had set up the proper channels to help her resolve her financial struggles and had found a therapist to work with her on the emotional scars that had driven her to make the choices she did. Over time, she showed signs of remorse, and after months of therapy, Daniel was cautiously hopeful that she was on the path to recovery. But no matter how much healing she did, there was an irrefutable truth. She had broken the trust, and that could never be fully restored. In the midst of all this, Daniel found himself reflecting on the nature of forgiveness and the choices he had made. Every day, he asked himself if he had done the right thing, if he had offered Lisa the opportunity to redeem herself out of genuine compassion, or if it had been a decision made out of weakness. The lines between justice and mercy blurred for him as time went on. He could feel his heart heavy with the complexity of human choices. If there was one thing he had learned through this ordeal, it was that the world wasn't black and white. People weren't simply good or bad. They were shaped by their circumstances, their fears, their mistakes. Daniel had given Lisa a chance to redeem herself, but was that enough? Could a person truly change after causing harm, or did the damage remain forever, no matter how hard they tried to mend it? At times, Daniel saw glimpses of the woman Lisa had once been, the kind, patient caretaker who had done everything to make Ethan feel safe, before fear and desperation clouded her decisions. And yet there were also moments when Daniel doubted whether he had made the right call. Was forgiveness truly the path forward, or would he regret not protecting his family more firmly? These questions hung heavy on his heart, even as he tried to find peace in his decision. There were also the quiet moments when he would catch Olivia looking at Ethan with a tenderness that suggested she was still grieving the innocence their son had lost. She had moments of doubt too, wondering if they had done enough, if they had been too quick to trust, too quick to forgive. But through it all, Daniel had come to realize that the decision he made wasn't just about Lisa. It was about what kind of person he wanted to be, the kind of father, the kind of husband. It was about standing up for his family's safety, while also choosing to see the humanity in others. It wasn't easy, and the weight of it often felt like a constant companion. But what Daniel had learned through the months of turmoil was that no decision was simple, no outcome guaranteed. And that was the truth about life, that the lines between right and wrong were rarely clear. They were shaped by the choices we made, the mercy we extended, and the wisdom we gained in the aftermath. As for Ethan, over time, he slowly began to emerge from the shell that had encased him. It wasn't a swift process, and the scars of the past lingered in his quieter moments, but Daniel saw the spark in his son's eyes slowly returning. Ethan had always been resilient, and in many ways, that resilience began to shine through again. But it would be a long time before the shadows of that betrayal were fully gone. And for that, Daniel knew, they would need to work together as a family, he, Olivia, and Ethan, uniting in their healing, rather than falling apart under the weight of it all. The final months of the year were a time of reflection and rebuilding. They attended family therapy, all three of them, working through their pain, their fears, their broken trust. It was slow, painstaking work, but it was necessary. Daniel often looked at his family during those sessions and wondered if they would ever truly return to the way they were before all of this, before the secrets, the betrayal, and the painful lessons learned the hard way. But one thing was certain, their bond had changed. They had faced an unimaginable challenge, and while the wounds would take time to heal, they had found strength in each other. The final question lingered. Had they done the right thing? Had Daniel made the right choice by offering Lisa redemption, by not pressing charges and allowing her the chance to turn her life around? In many ways, the answer was impossible to find. The story didn't come with neat resolutions or moral certainties. Life was a complex web of choices, consequences, and growth. And in the end, Daniel had to trust that he had done his best. He had chosen to protect his family, to help Lisa find her way back from the brink, and to let forgiveness guide his decisions. It wasn't easy. It wasn't perfect. But it was the only choice that had felt right in a world where nothing else seemed so clear. And so, with the heavy weight of the past still present, but slowly lifting, Daniel looked ahead to the future. He didn't know what it would hold, but he knew that with time, healing, and love, his family would find their way forward. And that, he realized, was the most important thing of all.